Good evening, and welcome to a virtual evening with Richard Rothstein, author of the New York Times bestseller, The Color of Law. My name is Vivian Oden, Vice President for Special Projects at the Hampton Roads Community Foundation, and we are delighted that you have joined us for what we believe will be a very thought-provoking and informative discussion on the historical roots of residential segregation in America. Tonight, you will also hear thoughts from expert panelists in the region who will provide a more localized perspective on racial inequities and residential housing disparities. The Hampton Roads Community Foundation firmly believes that racial equity is essential to the success of our region and its people. And advancing a more equitable and inclusive community is core to our mission. Through this event, it is our intent to address structural racism embedded in our culture, laws and policies, educational institutions, and economy that threatens opportunities for everyone in our region to thrive. Serving as our moderator this evening is Ms. Jamila LaCruz. Ms. LaCruz manages her own law practice in Norfolk, where she focuses on criminal defense and divorce matters. Previously, she served as an assistant public defender for the city of Norfolk, immediate past president of the Southampton Roads Bar Association, and the immediate past chair of the Norfolk and Portsmouth Bar Association Young Lawyers Section. She is currently serving a 4-year term as secretary of the Virginia State Board of Elections, which is a 3-member board appointed by the governor. And she is vice chair of the City of Norfolk Board of Zoning Appeals. Ms. LaCruz is also recognized as the current Virginia State Bar Young Lawyer of the Year. She is a graduate of the University of Richmond and William & Mary School of Law. Joining us now, Jamila LaCruz.
Thank you, Vivian, for that welcome and introduction, and thank you all for tuning in tonight, even as we've had to reschedule this event due to the pandemic. Like many of you, I've been looking forward to this discussion for quite some time, and I'd like to congratulate and thank the first 100 registrants who submitted questions for our program. You received a complimentary copy of The Color of Law, and following tonight's conversation with Mr. Rothstein, I'm sure you'll want to get started reading if you haven't already. We also want to spark healthy dialogue on social media, so we encourage you to live tweet your thoughts or any important takeaways shared this evening using the hashtag ColorOfLaw757. That's hashtag ColorOfLaw757. I want to pause for a moment to acknowledge the Community Foundation's board members who are tuning in, as well as several city and state officials joining us this evening. On behalf of the Community Foundation and President and CEO, Dr. Deborah DeCroce, we thank all of you for being part of this very important and timely conversation. As we close out Black History Month, a month when we reflect on the contributions and advancements of African Americans, it is also important that we consider, beyond this month, the work that still exists to ensure a more equitable and inclusive America, free of racial bias that limits opportunities for people of color. Tonight, Richard Rothstein, author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, will share some insight on the historical limits related to housing. And now a little bit about our author. Mr. Rothstein is a former columnist for the New York Times and author of several additional nonfiction books on race, education, and policy. He is a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and a senior fellow emeritus at the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. Mr. Rothstein has spent years documenting the evidence that government not merely ignored discriminatory practices in the residential sphere, but promoted them. The impact, as we know, has been devastating for generations of African Americans who were denied the right to live where they wanted to live and raise and school their children where they could flourish most successfully. And with that said, let's get to the program. Joining us now is Mr. Richard Rothstein. Good evening, Mr. Rothstein.
Good evening, and thanks for inviting me to engage with you in this conversation today. My book, The Color of Law, has a very simple theme. The theme is that we are all of us under the misimpression that the reason that every community in this country is racially segregated is because of private activity. We call it de facto segregation, just the result of private homeowners or landlords not being willing to sell or rent to African Americans, or private businesses, banks, real estate agencies, developers discriminating in how they sold or rented housing. Or maybe people just like to live with each other of the same race. Or maybe it's because of income differences. We call all of this de facto segregation. And we say that because it was created by individual bigotry, by prejudice, but not by government, government has no responsibility to fix it. It's not a civil rights violation. The theme of the book is that this is untrue. The notion of de facto segregation is not based in fact. Every metropolitan area in this country was segregated by racially explicit public policy on the part of the federal, state, and local governments. Because it was created by racially explicit public policy, ordinances, laws, regulations, policies, it's a civil rights violation as much as the segregation of water fountains or lunch counters or buses were a civil rights violation in the 20th century. Because residential segregation is government created, not the result of private bigotry. Of course, private bigotry cooperated with it, but it was government created. Because it's government created, it's a civil rights violation. We have an obligation under our Constitution as American citizens to redress civil rights violations.
And in your book, The Color of Law, you discuss the history of how laws, policies, and government programs have caused residential segregation in America. Could you please share with us the effects of residential segregation and explain to the audience what redlining is and what impact it has on neighborhoods?
Well, let me divide that into two topics. One is the creation of segregation, and the other is redlining. Let me first start with the creation of segregation. There were many, many federal, state, and local policies that segregated this country. Perhaps the most powerful was a policy of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration in the immediate post-World War II period to suburbanize the entire white working class and lower middle class population into single family homes in all white suburbs that exist in your community and in every community in the country today. Millions of returning war veterans came home, black and white, needing housing. They were living, whites and blacks, working class families, middle class families at the time, were living in urban areas. The suburbs hadn't yet been created for ordinary people. The only people living outside cities were the affluent. The federal government embarked on a program to suburbanize the entire white working class population, returning war veterans in single family homes in all white suburbs. The most famous of these is east of New York City, but they exist in Virginia, they exist in Chicago, they exist in Detroit, they are everywhere. The most famous of them is Levittown, east of New York City. Perhaps you've heard of it. 17,000 homes in one place. Most of them weren't as large as this, but many were nearly as large. The builder, Levitt, could never have assembled the capital to build 17,000 homes in one place. No bank would lend it to him. The only way he could get the money to build those homes, those suburban homes, was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting the plans for his development and a commitment never to sell a home to an African American, and every one of the builders all across the country had to make a similar commitment. The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration even placed a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was an explicit racial policy. It wasn't the action of rogue bureaucrats in the Federal Housing Administration or Veterans Administration. It was written out in a federal policy manual called the Underwriting Manual, which was distributed to appraisers around the country whose job it was to approve the application or recommend the application of builders for federal bank guarantees to create suburban locations. The manual said explicitly you could not recommend a federal bank guarantee for a loan to a developer who was going to sell to African Americans. The manual went so far as to say you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan to a developer who was going to build an all-white project that was near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's how the white suburbs of this country were created. There's nothing de facto about them. It was a racially explicit policy. Let me talk now about the second part of your question, which is redlining. Redlining talks about the opposite kind of thing. What I've just described is how the white suburbs were created. Redlining describes how urban areas where African Americans lived were disinvested. The federal government in the 1930s drew maps of every metropolitan area in the country. The maps were intended to guide federal agencies like the Federal Housing Administration about where it was too risky to make loans for mortgages. Every area where African Americans lived was colored red in those maps, indicating to the federal government that it was not a good place to make loans. That's where the term redlining comes from. As a result of that policy, African Americans couldn't get conventional mortgages or FHA mortgages in African American neighborhoods that had been created by these policies of segregation that I talked about before. Because they couldn't get conventional loans, speculators preyed on them. They sold them homes, or they didn't really sell them. They called them sales, but they weren't sales. In effect, they were rentals. People thought they were buying homes, but they had no equity. They didn't have an amortized mortgage. They simply made monthly payments. And if they missed a payment, they could be evicted with no equity, nothing. Everything they put into the home was lost, even though they were investing in it, thinking they were owning a home. As a result, they had to pay much more for housing because the speculators charged them more for housing than whites were paying in similar homes in white communities. African Americans had to pay more for housing than whites did. Because they had to pay so much more, they subdivided their homes and rented out parts of them. They doubled, tripled up with relatives. The neighborhoods became overcrowded. Cities stopped providing adequate services, less garbage collection, inadequate sewerage, no sidewalks in those neighborhoods. And so they became slums in many cases because of this disinvestment that was caused by the redlining. So you had two different policies, two opposite sides of the coin.
And so you talked a little bit about de facto segregation as it relates to residences and neighborhoods. Do you have any other examples? And is that what you mean when you say it's too comfortable a notion to just essentially say everything it's de facto as opposed to de jure segregation?
Well, as I said, de facto segregation is the notion that segregation occurred and was created without government participation, by private bigotry, by the actions of banks and real estate agencies and developers in the private economy, by people liking to live with each other of the same race, by income differences. That's what de facto segregation is. The Supreme Court has said that if you have de facto segregation, it's not unconstitutional because government didn't create it, and therefore government is prohibited from doing anything to fix it. As I said, this is a myth. There's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. Of course, there was private bigotry. I mentioned these developers before. Someone like Levitt in New York creating Levittown. Levitt was a bigot. He wouldn't have sold homes to African Americans if he had a choice, but the government didn't have to give him that choice. He only built that project, and the same thing is true of developers all over the country, in the Richmond area, in Washington, and everywhere else. They're only able to build those projects with government bank guarantees. And if the government had said to them, okay, we'll guarantee your bank loans, but you have to sell homes on a non-discriminatory basis, no matter how bigoted they would have had to do so. So it's not that there wasn't private bigotry involved. There were private bigots, developers, banks, real estate agents who were more than happy to cooperate with the federal program. But if the federal program had required them as a condition of participation of getting government money, had required them to follow the Constitution, they would have had to do so whether they liked it or not. So when you talk about the fact that there was both government participation and private bigotry, it's true. But the private bigotry alone couldn't have done it. The federal government's role in this was required to create the segregation that we know.
Okay. And you've given us a lot of information so far. Have you received any critics saying that these practices are long gone and not present today? And what's your response to these people?
Well, you're right. The policies are no longer in force today, but they were so powerful that they have an ongoing effect. And let me go back to the example I gave you before to show you how that works. Those suburbs that were created by the federal government for whites only in the mid-20th century were for working class families, inexpensive homes. They cost about $7,000, $8,000 at the time. In today's money, that's about $100,000. The returning war veterans didn't have to make any down payment. So anybody who had a job in the post-war boom, and blacks and whites did, could have afforded with a long-term mortgage like the FHA and VA were offering, amortized mortgage, could have afforded to buy those homes, but only whites were permitted to do so. Well, those homes in suburbs everywhere in the country, in Richmond and Norfolk and New York and Chicago and Detroit, everywhere, they no longer sell for $100,000. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think you can buy a suburban home for $100,000 in your community today. Depending on the area of the country, they sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, in some places even more than that. The white families who were subsidized by the federal government to purchase those homes gained over the next couple of generations wealth from the equity appreciation of those homes. If they sell for $500,000 now, that's $400,000 in appreciation, wealth that the white families gained. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to take care of temporary emergencies, perhaps, maybe unemployment, a short-term unemployment, maybe a medical emergency. They used it to subsidize their retirements. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans, prohibited from participating in this wealth generating program, gained no such wealth. The result is that today, African American incomes on average are about 60% of white incomes, family incomes on average. There's a big disparity there, but 60%. You would think if there was a 60% income ratio, there'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well. People can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But the reality is that although African American family incomes are about 60% of white family incomes on average, African American household wealth is only about 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century and that has never been remedied. So what does this wealth, this enormous wealth gap mean? Well, it means that African Americans, because of this unconstitutional policy and its effects today in creating this wealth gap, are locked into less adequate neighborhoods. It means that we have an achievement gap in schools because so many children, African American children living in less well-resourced neighborhoods, come to school with social and economic disadvantages that the schools are incapable of overcoming.
And moving on to solutions, what can we do to deconstruct residential segregation? And for example, what role do white families play in the continuation of segregated suburbia?
Well, let me say that the solutions are well known. Policy experts, think tanks, journalists spin out ideas all the time. I can give you a few of them, but let me say that the problem is not solutions. We know what the solutions are. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to be as ambitious, as militant as the civil rights movement was in the 1960s, that eliminated segregation in public accommodations and public transportation and other public facilities in the 1960s. So I can tell you what some of these solutions are, but they're not politically feasible now because the civil rights movement, a new civil rights movement, hasn't created the political support for them.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Rothstein. It's been a pleasure Thank you for joining us this evening and sharing your perspective. Your insight has truly been invaluable.
Thank you very much.
At this time, we're going to open the conversation up for a question and answer period. These questions were previously submitted by our registrants, so thank you to everyone for your participation. Remember to share your thoughts and comments on social media using the hashtag coloroflaw757. Our first audience question comes from Davy Smith III in Portsmouth. Davy asks, why do you believe redlining still exists today?
Well, official redlining doesn't exist, but once you create a system, race-neutral policies can reinforce that system. So to take the example that I gave before, even if the federal government was going to abolish its rule that placed a priority on placing low-income housing in low-income neighborhoods, it would still be the place that most low-income housing would be placed, because developers would rather build housing in places where there's no community opposition. If they try to build housing for lower income families in a suburban neighborhood, they have to hold 100 community meetings explaining why they're bringing Black and brown people into their neighborhood. They don't want to do that. They'd rather do it where there's no opposition. Land is cheaper in low income segregated neighborhoods. It's easier to rent apartments if somebody can just walk by and see a sign in the window, somebody who's eligible. You put a sign in the window in a suburban neighborhood, nobody's going to see it. So without explicit racial policies, existing programs will reinforce segregation unless there is an explicit, conscious, race-conscious remedy. This segregation was created with race-conscious policies. It can't be uncreated with race-neutral policies. It's got to be as intentional to desegregate as it was to segregate.
Gail Nakula and Benita Anthony from Norfolk want to know, what thoughts do you have about the intersection of residential segregation with gentrification, and how do we combat the present systems of oppression that allow housing displacement and gentrification?
Well, I said before that the policies to redress segregation are well known, and let me include in that the policies to resist displacement from gentrification are also well known. We can't stop gentrification entirely. It's something of a contradiction in terms to say that you can improve the quality of resources in a low-income community and then expect middle-income people not to want to move into it. Once the community gets better, it's going to attract people of higher income levels. But we do know what to do to prevent displacement. The problem is not the policies, the problem is the lack of political will. We should have very rigorous rent control in these communities that prevent landlords from forcing people to leave because they raise rents as the neighborhood gentrifies to an exorbitant level. Landlords are entitled to a fair return on their investment, but you can limit rent rates so that they get that fair return, but not an exploitative return. We should have limits on condominium conversions in any community. Some places that's been done, but in very, very few. That would also prevent massive displacement. We should have inclusionary zoning rules that require any development to include a share of units, both for low and for moderate income families. That would also prevent a substantial amount of displacement. And most importantly, perhaps, we should have property tax freezes for existing homeowners, because there are many African-American homeowners in neighborhoods that are gentrifying who may have purchased their home 20, 30 years ago, say for $50,000. And the home is now worth in this gentrifying neighborhood a few $100,000. Well, if they pay property taxes at the $50,000 rate value on the $50,000 value for as long as they live in that home, and then sell it for $300,000, the lost property taxes that they didn't pay because of the freeze can at that point be returned to the Treasury. So instead of making a $250,000 capital gain when they sell the project, they only make a $200,000 capital gain. That would be a very reasonable policy to implement. We don't do it again not because we don't know what to do. The program I just described of this property tax freeze and the recapture of lost property tax as a point of sale is actually, it was promoted by the Internal Revenue Service Commissioner under Obama. So this is not a secret. We don't do it not because we don't know what to do. We don't do it because there is no civil rights movement that's making it uncomfortable not to do it.
Katrin Marr from Norfolk and Susan Finke from Virginia Beach ask, in the current political and social climate, do you see any opportunities for reforms on the national, state, or local levels? And what can local governments do to have the greatest impact on reversing some effects of residential segregation?
Well, I mentioned some of them earlier. I think probably the biggest thing that local governments can do is change their zoning rules that require, in many neighborhoods, in many all-white neighborhoods, that require only single-family homes on large lot sizes to be built. That prevents working class families who may be disproportionately African American and in some communities Hispanic from moving to garden apartments or local, smaller units, townhouses in those communities, as well as low-level apartment buildings that fit into the architecture of the neighborhoods. That's changing those zoning laws is probably the most important thing that a local government can do.
Great. Thank you again to everyone for submitting questions and comments. They certainly helped spur our dialogue. And thank you so much to Mr. Rothstein for joining us this evening. We're going to keep this conversation going with our panelists for the latter half of the event. And we would love to see your comments during the show. Make sure you use the hashtag ColorOfLaw757. Joining us now is Mrs. Eugenia Jackson, an active real estate professional in the Hampton Roads, Virginia area since 1989, and the board president of the Hampton Roads Association of Real Estate Brokers, and Dr. Johnny Finn, an associate professor of geography in the Department of Sociology, Social Work, and Anthropology at Christopher Newport University. Welcome to you both. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for having us.
So, Mrs. Jackson, could you tell us a little bit more about the Hampton Roads Association of Real Estate Brokers and the role you play as president?
Absolutely. But first, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. The Hampton Roads Association of Real Estate Brokers is a NAREB chapter. NAREB stands for the National Association of Real Estate Brokers. Our Hampton Roads chapter is one of approximately 100 across the country. Our average membership is probably stays around 30, but we're trying our best to grow that. So that's why this is very important to me. NAREB is an organization that was formed in 1947. And I think with Dr. Rothstein's pretty much documented the discrimination that was prevalent during that time. Just like Black homeowners could not live in certain neighborhoods, real estate agents could not get information on houses for sale in certain neighborhoods, nor were they allowed to show property in those areas. We didn't have the information and we couldn't show the property. So they kind of formed their own little collective, and that's how they managed to survive. They had listing data that they traded amongst each other, and that's how they made their living.
And as a real estate professional, have you seen how laws and policies negatively affect your clients of color trying to purchase homes or get mortgage loans?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it still prevails today, and it changes. It changes constantly. And I think Richard Rothstein, he's done an excellent job of documenting it from the past. But I want people to be sure to understand it's not gone. It hasn't gone. I did have a chance to go to a presentation with Dr. Richard Rothstein at the Congressional Black Caucus, and the subject there was then and now. How are we handling the different policies that affect home ownership? And some of the things that we are still facing that it really impacts things is credit scoring. Credit scoring would determine the interest rate you're going to get on your loan. Also, there is there's an anomaly I'm just becoming familiar with. It's called loan level pricing adjustments, and what that does is for lower cost loans. In order for the lenders or the mortgage industry to make money, they add additional discount points to that loan, that low-level loan, because that ensures that they make enough money out of the transaction, and that encourages them to do those loans. So that definitely impacts the lower income, and unfortunately, African Americans are overrepresented in that group.
And thank you so much for this information. Now, Dr. Finn, we want to bring you into the conversation. Your research focuses on the geography of race and racism in America. And tonight, Mr. Rothstein shared with us the impact of zoning. Would you share your thoughts on the impact of zoning as it relates to residential segregation?
Sure, I'm happy to. First, though, I'd like to echo Ms. Jackson and thank you all for having me share with you this evening. It's a real honor and treat to be with you tonight. So yeah, I mean, it's worth noting that the history of zoning in this country goes back at least a century and a half and has from the very beginning been overtly discriminatory. The first zoning laws were in Northern California cities in the middle of the 19th century, and they came into effect to zone laundries and other businesses that were associated with the Asian community in those cities after a federal court found in 1866 that they simply couldn't just simply overtly discriminate at the city level against Asian people. And so they found this workaround, this kind of colorblind workaround to say, well, we're not going to zone against a particular group of people based on ethnicity or on race or immigrant status. We're going to zone based on this particular activity that they do. And so this kind of zoning has been used against Jewish communities in New York, for example, later in the 20th century. Zoning has been used against all kinds of different marginalized and minority communities in order to perpetuate segregation. And so the way that it's manifested itself in the present day that is most talked about in this area of research is in terms of single family zoning and the impact that has on effectively pricing out lower income folks. But because as Mr. Rothstein really clearly showed, the history of overt racial segregation has led to a racialized wealth gap where white people have larger kind of nest eggs, so to speak. They have larger net worths. A recent study showed that it's almost an 87% wealth gap between the median white family and the median Black family. And so if you maintain single family zoning, you're effectively maintaining relatively high home values per unit in predominantly white communities that have the effect of pricing out largely non-white home buyers.
Okay, and back to Dr. Finn, I know that you conducted extensive research in Brazil, Cuba, and more recently in this area in Hampton Roads with your current project titled Living Together, Living Apart. Could you tell us a little bit more about this project and why you launched it?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this work. It is ongoing, and we're now several years in, and we're collecting both quantitative data, economic and race data that comes from the census and from other federal and state agencies. But really, the backbone of the project is just talking to individuals about their experiences well into the 21st century of living in what are still largely segregated neighborhoods in Hampton Roads. The project title comes exactly from that, Living Together, Living Apart, because in a certain sense, if you zoom out and look at the whole city or the whole metropolitan area that includes, Newport News, where I live, Hampton, Norfolk, Virginia Beach, Portsmouth, all the surrounding areas, it's actually a very diverse metropolitan area. But when you zoom into any individual neighborhood, that diversity really largely erodes. And we're found that most of us, at the end of each day, we go home to houses or apartments that are on blocks, on city blocks that are populated mostly by people that look like us. And that's actually a classic statistical measure of segregation as well. But rather than just doing kind of the statistics and the mapping, we also wanted to talk to people to better understand the human experience and the human toll of living in segregated neighborhoods. So I have a research team. Over the last several years, about 10 different students have filtered through. I currently have a research team of 3 really outstanding seniors here at Christopher Newport University who are working with me. We've interviewed well over 100 people. We're doing oral history interviews. We distribute cameras and have our participant photographers shoot pictures of places that are meaningful to them in their life. And then we interview them about their images. And all the material currently, as it comes through, is available on our project's website. And we're currently working, the pandemic has slowed down the public showing of this work, but we're developing a fairly extensive and multimedia museum exhibition that we hope that sometime this year, now in 2021, we hope to launch that publicly. I can't give any details at this point about it because the COVID-19 pandemic has kind of thrown everything into disarray. But we're working on figuring out a way that we can bring the photographic material, the cartographic and mapping material that we have, and most importantly, bring the stories that we've collected from hundreds of people who we've talked to over the last couple of years. We can bring them in and put on a series of, we'll bring them to an exhibition and then also put on a series of public events that invite the community to kind of come in and learn with us through all these materials.
Well, we're certainly looking forward to hearing these stories and encourage everyone tuning in to visit livingapart.com for more details on this project. And we hope everyone's enjoying this important conversation so far, and reminding you that we're watching, if you're watching on social media, to use the hashtag coloroflaw757 in order to join the conversation and share your thoughts. Now for our panelists, this next set of questions are open for both of you to answer. And we'll start with Dr. Finn on the first question. Mr. Rothstein offered insights on the role white families play in the continuation of segregated suburbia. And how would you describe the current issues of white flight in communities? And what do you think the role is that white families play in the continuation of segregated suburbia? Dr. Finn?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I guess I can answer it with kind of 3 interrelated points. First is I understand that the term white flight is a kind of a broad term that probably most people are familiar with. I find it a little bit problematic because it assumes that white people just kind of randomly decided to kind of move out to the suburbs when, as Mr. Rothstein really clearly articulated, that simply wasn't the case. White families in the post-World War II years were lured to the suburbs by subsidized housing, and Black families were prevented from being able to take advantage of those same kind of discounts in mortgage rates. And so I understand this idea of white flight, but I think we need to think about it and conceptualize it more systematically in terms of the overtly racist housing policies that were at the root of white flight. That said, in the present day, I think that and I speak obviously as a white person, I think that white people, especially those of us who are kind of want to be conscious to racism and want to be conscious to the impacts of racist housing policies and so on, we really are going to have to contend with NIMBYism, with this idea of not in my backyard. Because it's one thing for me in the abstract to say, I'm in favor of getting rid of single family zoning. It's a very different thing for me when I'm a homeowner, when I'm invested in a neighborhood that takes advantage of higher home values because we have single family zoning, to say, now I agree with my neighborhood being rezoned or the neighborhood right next to it being rezoned. And so I think we really are going to have to contend with the idea that there is going to be, like, this is not an abstract question that only takes kind of fancy talking and posts on social media to resolve. This is a material question that we are going to have to be fundamentally invested in.
Mrs. Jackson?
That was one of Mr. Rothstein's questions that really challenged me. I kind of see it more or less as a economic segregation. As a real estate professional right now in this day and time, I know there's a shortage of housing, out there for a certain price range, certain price ranges. So I have found that there is resistance to someone who is not of color and they qualify for a property in this price range being uncomfortable in a certain neighborhood. I've had some of them say, Mom, I have one instance where I'm driving through the neighborhood showing the property and the kid said, Mom, you said we weren't going to be the only white kids in the neighborhood again, and I'm like, and the parents, they probably seized up when they said that. But, I think it's the economics are playing a real big, it just has a big role in it right now, so.
And back to Dr. Finn, on a more local level, how have housing laws and policies contributed to systemic racism in the Hampton Roads region?
Yeah, so I think it's worth, with that question, to think about kind of our past and our present, because there's sets of policies that are definitely in our past, that continue to have reverberations in the present, but the policies themselves are no longer in place. And I think, for example, like racially restrictive covenants. A lot of neighborhoods in Norfolk, a lot of neighborhoods in Newport News and Hampton, if you go to the city courthouse and dig through the property records, you can find just shocking and horrifying racially restrictive covenants in language that I will not repeat, and I do not repeat in my classrooms or in my presentations, language barring certain groups of people based on race and ethnicity from buying homes, from leasing homes, from renting homes, from being willed homes in particular neighborhoods. The Daily Press has done, back in the 90s, the Daily Press did some really interesting reporting on the racially restrictive covenants in a couple of particular neighborhoods in the city of Hampton, going all the way back to the 1890s.
Okay, and this next question is for Mrs. Jackson. Do you have any thoughts on what we can do in our region to deconstruct residential segregation?
In our region, we have a little bit of extra help. I see it. I'm a transplant here. I think we have such a large military population in this area, and the military, although it has its own segregated history, but I think the military is helping us deconstruct segregation in this area. I know when I came here, I lived in California and I'm from Arizona, which is bizarre to a lot of people. But I came here and I asked a lot about the various neighborhoods, and I've been told a lot of stories about certain areas of town that I've seen it bear out to be untrue. Thank goodness. So.
Earlier in the discussion, Mr. Rothstein calls for a new civil rights movement, similar to the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. What are your thoughts on the emergence of a new civil rights movement to specifically address housing disparities?
He's completely correct. It is going to take a movement, civil, I don't know. I really and truly believe that there is a movement that is at the ballot box right now. I think the African-American community is waking up to the power of the vote. And I just feel like politics and regulations got us in the mess that we're in. And it's going to take politics and regulations to get us out of that. And we just have to take a more active role. As part of NARAB, we do have a real strong advocacy arm. And, politics, between politics and the Black church, those are the ways we're going to work things out. Okay.
Well, thank you both for this wealth of information you provided this evening. Before I let you go, we have 2 audience questions. First is from Julie Snell from Norfolk. And Ms. Snell asks, in what ways do you think systemic housing disparities can be rectified by community members? Let's start with Dr. Finn.
Well, so the question is, what ways do we think that systemic housing disparities can be rectified by community members? I think, and I've already mentioned it before, I think we really are going to have to start carefully examining how the trap of NIMBYism, the trap of kind of not in my backyard, to understand that especially at the local level, making changes implicates our own communities and our own neighborhoods to be a part of the solution. And so we're going to have to think about it that way. We're going to have to think about zoning regulations. We're going to have to think about evictions in the really shockingly disproportionate eviction rates amongst African American folks in this region. That's going to be exacerbated by, or it already is exacerbated by COVID-19, but even beyond COVID-19 and before COVID-19, it was already a crisis.
And the final question is from Philip Page. Mrs. Jackson, he wants to know, how can the realtor and business community be educated about laws that direct or steer them toward illegal housing practices?
Well, for the business community, real estate is a business, but I can't speak for the business community, but I can speak for the real estate community. Fair housing is at the core of our existence. We have a code of ethics, and we have constant fair housing education, and we can literally lose our livelihood, our license for not for steering people the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. So we're very, very conscious of it. We're very that's a scary thing for us. They have testers that come in. They'll tell you early on, you may have a tester. They'll ask you these types of questions. So the real estate community is fearful of violating these things. So, and it happens. I've heard stories across the country, and the real estate agents have gotten caught. And your errors and emissions insurance, they make sure it won't help you get out of one of those situations. So in the real estate community, we are strongly encouraged not to steer away from segregated housing policies.
Well, thank you, everyone. I want to thank all of our panelists for sharing with us this evening. Mrs. Jackson, Dr. Finn, thank you for your time and your contributions to our region.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the Hampton Roads Community Foundation for sponsoring this event and creating a platform that provides an opportunity for rich and transformative conversations. Thank you to our partners, the Chesapeake Bar Association, Norfolk and Portsmouth Bar Association Foundation, Southampton Roads Bar Association, and Virginia Beach Bar Association. The information presented in this virtual environment was thoughtful and purposeful, and we hope that everyone was able to gain a deeper understanding of structural inequities from the perspectives shared tonight. It's been a pleasure serving as your moderator for this evening, and thank you again to the Community Foundation for the opportunity. At this time, I will turn the program over to Dr. Deborah DeCroce, President and CEO at the Hampton Roads Community Foundation.
Wow, what a powerful conversation. I'm Debbie DeCroce, President and CEO of the Hampton Roads Community Foundation. Our board of directors, my colleagues, and I are so pleased that you joined us for such a meaningful discussion. Thanks as well for your questions, your comments, and your continued engagement on social media. Indeed, we've covered much ground on a topic that has long had a foundational bearing on systemic racism in our country: residential segregation and discriminatory housing practices, inequities in healthcare, education, and wealth. Each is an underlying part of America's history of segregation, and our reckoning of them, one by one, is a necessary step in moving toward Dr. King's dream of a racially equitable and just society that, in his words, lives out the true meaning of its American creed of equality for all. Mr. Rothstein and our impressive panel have shown us how government at all levels and the public policy it makes has segregated America. And they have called us to action to help right this wrong. So I leave you with this question. What are we going to do about it? And where do we begin as individuals to challenge the structural racism that threatens our future and the futures of our children as a region, as a nation? Here are some initial actions we could take. Join your civic league and get to know your neighbors. Know your fair housing rights and responsibilities. Report housing discrimination you witness or experience. Advocate through your local PTA for integrated, equitable, high-quality educational experiences for all. Learn from segregation stories shared by the region's residents at living together and living apart. Avail yourself of the 30% discount link on the Foundation's website and read The Color of Law with your book club or your students. The link is good until March 4th. Seek out home ownership resources, such as the e-resource guide provided by Tidewater Home Funding and accessible through the Foundation's website. Write op-ed pieces, talk to your elected officials, join a local board or committee or commission, run for office, form coalitions. In short, play to your strengths and engage. Because at the end of the day, the business of an equitable and just society starts and ends with us. Again, many thanks for tuning in. As my colleague, Vice President Oden, said to me earlier today, we hope you learned something that you will share with someone. For more information about the Hampton Roads Community Foundation and our commitment to racial equity, visit www.hamptonroadscf.org. Have a wonderful evening.